Good morning, everybody. It is a Friday, and I am the Peacemonger. And this morning, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome onto the show my friend Pascal Lottaz. Pascal was one of the first people I spoke to after I left the diplomatic service. He's got an outstanding YouTube show already, which I'm sure you already know if you're watching me today. So he's been a real voice of reason and continues to be so. So I just wanted to say a huge thanks, Pascal, for all that you do from distant Japan.
Thank you very much, Ian, for the invitation, and thank you for the many times you came on to my show. It was always been a pleasure talking to you. So I'm very happy to talk for once on your show. And I let me just say I love the name of your show and your Substack. Peacemongers is what we need, and if I can support, I will support as a neutrality monger because together we gotta go against the other side. Because they want to get us into war, and they're getting. I mean, they already got us into wars and that we're stuck in at the moment, but they want to make it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think peacemongering and neutrality mongering go hand in hand. Actually, they're completely complementary
Hmm.
kind of disciplines. And one of the curious things right now is that Trump says that he's a president of peace, but he seems to be the one who's who's getting ready to start wars against neighboring states in the Americas and in Iran and so on. We were laughing because actually, just as we were due to start 15 minutes ago, and just as we were about to start, I had a power cut, which rendered us kind of dark for 15 minutes. And it's ironic. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but one of the things I wanted to talk about today briefly was about cancellation of alternative voices. And I thought, having your power cut when you're about to talk to neutrality monger feels like epic cancellation, although I'm sure it was really an electrical fault. Pascal, you're Swiss, a country with a proud record of neutrality, and actually recently, two of your citizens have been sanctioned, by the EU for saying things which don't accord to, the core kind of neoliberal, script. I mean, what's your take on this? Quite shocking, actually. Recent event where European, in the broadest sense, citizens are actually being sanctioned by the European Commission.
Yeah. Thanks for connecting that the censorship issue with the power cut and also with the sanctions, because I think this is actually quite significant about what's happening, but also of how we make sense of things. On the one hand, there are unfortunate coincidences or unfortunate things that happen that result in us not being able to communicate the way we want. The power cut surely is one of those. What happened to me last Sunday when when YouTube basically deleted, or they said terminated, my channel for 16 hours. I also take it as such because I still believe that that event was a glitch in the way that YouTube handles the spam, because spam has been increasing on the platform massively due to AI, and I do believe that I am a general collateral damage, and luckily my channel came back. But then we also have proper attempts at censorship, and they take various forms. They take the form of what happened just yesterday, Scott Ritter being debanked. It happens in the form of what happened to Larry C. Johnson, whom I just talked to this morning, who actually got thrown off YouTube for hate speech 1.5 years ago, and he never came back. His channel was never reinstated. It happens through the Twitter files. We know that the White House was taking direct influence on what was happening in Twitter before Elon Musk bought it back up and bought it, and how there's an influence campaigns, but not influence campaigns. How there is straight influence taking by state actors on the ability of people to exchange and communicate. And on the very heavy front, on the heaviest front, there's the sanctions, and the EU has taken sanctions against EU and Schengen area citizens. So, of course, Switzerland is not part of the EU, but it is part of the Schengen area and it is a closely associated state and so on and so forth. And taking measures against two of my compatriots is quite an escalation. But the EU is also sanctioning now Hussein Dogru, a German citizen residing in Germany. I mean, it's extremely draconian what's happening, and I will talk about that in a second. But the EU is not the only one doing that. The US sanctioned Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur for Palestine. The US sanctioned judges and the general prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. I mean, these sanctions regimes and sanctions tool is being used, especially by Western states. I'm actually not aware of Russia or China using sanctions, but the US and Europe uses sanctions heavily in order to crack down on dissent. And the important thing about sanctions to understand is that they are not legal measures. They are not measures by the judiciary. They are not part of of that branch of government. Sanctions are a foreign policy tool. They are wielded by the foreign policy part of the executive branch in the EU and in the US. And as such, they are not embedded in any kind of legal process. You know, the way that we build huge legal structures, including, you know, a first court, appeals court, third court, Supreme Court, da, 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 all of that system, everything doesn't apply. Nor does the usual, nor do the usual measures of legality, you know, due process, the right to be heard before you're convicted, the assumption of innocence, but also the rule that there is no punishment without law, right? You cannot just make up a law and then start punishing people for what they did before the law came into force. Also, that is not in effect, because the sanctions now, you start the sanctions lead to punishment of behavior that is in no way, shape, or form illegal, of people who have in no way, shape, or form been informed previously that what they're doing is in, you know, is regarded as punishable. And that's also why the European Union, in its official explanation about the sanctions on its own homepage, says, the EU Commission says, sanctions are not a punishment. They are not meant to punish, they're meant to educate, actually discipline. It's a disciplinary measure because, of course, the executive cannot punish you. The executive branch is not allowed to punish people. It is the executive branch enforces what the judiciary rules and so on, right? I mean, the police forces and whatnot, they enforce, but they do not themselves punish. But we are this sanctions regime is now developing in the West, EU and US, into an extra legal. I call it extra legal because it's not illegal, it's not against the law. Actually, the people who do that are acting within the capacities that they have based upon the well, in the EU, it's the Lisbon Treaty and the other instruments that give them this power. They act within that framework, but they create then a tool that acts as punishment, but by circumventing the entire legal structure. And that's pretty much a bad situation to be in. It's a really bad situation because it means that if this regime can and will be expanded, and it means now a very small circle of EU executives and in the US too have a tool with which they can punish each one of us and can put really draconian measures on us, and circumvent the entire legal system that we've built to protect each other from such arbitrary political persecution.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Pascal. I'll come on to the sanctions in a bit more detail because, as you know, I was involved in the UK sanction system, you know, against Russia. But can you bring us up to? I'm talking to Larry actually next week, Larry Johnson. But can you briefly, for the benefit of viewers who may not already know, bring us up to date with what happened with Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson in specifics? Because I think that'd be a helpful update before I sort of delve into the issues.
So one of the things that surprised me when I learned about it on Monday actually was that Larry Johnson had been kicked off YouTube 1.5 years ago. I didn't know about that because he's been on many shows and I've seen him so many times. I didn't realize, but his YouTube channel was terminated and terminated for good 1.5 years ago. And that's why he now publishes on Sonar 21, and which is a homepage that he himself runs, and other outlets. But he's banned from using YouTube due to he's accused of hate speech. And I am actually, and I will have the video with him will come out in a couple of days on my channel. And with Scott Ritter, yesterday the news broke actually that his bank just terminated its relationship with him. Apparently, no reason given. Scott Ritter managed to find out something about it. He says that and I'm just following what he himself told us on via X, that was intervention from higher above that apparently told the bank to terminate his relationships. He should be getting his money back if everything goes according to what they've been telling him, but it seems as if though the powers that be, even in the US, are trying to crack down on dissent. And one thing I must warn, though, is that something that Edward Snowden actually warned also is that we must not misinterpret every action as automatically a sign of repression and a sign of um, um, intentional interference with our rights. There are moments when mistakes happen. I think my own termination was such a moment. Maybe Scott Ritter too. Maybe the bank has other reasons. I don't know. I am not sure. But at the moment, what we see is a pattern of people being thrown off platforms and so on that is very worrisome. However, I warn against seeing the hand of of shadowy people everywhere. With a debanking thing, it's difficult though to think about something else. However, I just want to put that out there.
Yeah. No, I can completely see that because certainly when I was based at the British Embassy in Moscow, I think in around 2016, there was a time when the Russian trade delegation's bank account in London, their trade promotion arm of the Russian government in London, was the same thing as Scott Ritter. It was kind of it was stopped overnight. I mean, they didn't have their assets frozen and such. They could get their money back, but the bank refused to kind of provide banking services for them
Mm.
anymore. They've rectified that situation eventually. But the point I'm getting around to is actually, banks do take signals, from the government, even if they're
Mhm.
not even if they're not legally required to. And the signal from the British government at that time was, of course, and still today, that Russia's bad and we should clamp down and all this bad Russian money has been coming into our country. And so while I didn't think that, in fact, I know that the government didn't order the bank to shut down the Russian trade delegation's bank account, I certainly got the sense that the bank was taking signals that actually doing any business with Russia was bad, and therefore going to close their bank account. So there's that kind of subtle
Yeah.
signs, and hints that the government does give off.
And
But with
if I
Larry,
may just jump in on this one, I mean, this is especially the case for individuals who get sanctioned. So I did 3 interviews, one with Natalie Yamp, with Jacques Beau, and with Hussein Dogru, and they all said, "Look, we are." I mean, Hussein Dogru lives in the EU, so the EU institutions have to block him by law. But Natalie Yamp, she's outside of the EU. She's actually currently in Africa, and her bank accounts are in Switzerland, and her Swiss bank terminated her euro accounts. She had an account in Swiss francs and in euros, and the euro one was terminated. She got that money to the other account, but then there's another bank in Switzerland, the bank of her landlord in Switzerland, the Swiss bank, that refuses to receive payments from her because that bank voluntarily implements the EU sanctions because they want to make sure they always stay on the good graces and don't accidentally get into any kind of problems with the EU, because these banks and these organizations, including airlines and so on, they have they have legal departments with quite a few lawyers just hired to do due diligence. And these people, they will always try to err on the side of caution for the institution, which then means, in the case of doubt, rather implement all of it, right? So, and this is a real problem now for even for people who outside the EU. that a good number of institutions, even if they don't have to, do implement these sanctions, which makes them even more powerful. I mean, it's the structural power of the EU that's also being wielded that goes beyond the geographical confinement of the EU.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I wanted to go back a bit to the point about extra legality of this,
Mm,
because certainly in the case of the UK regime, which I obviously know very well, it has taken a decisive shift towards extra legality over the past year. In July of last year, the Supreme Court of the UK, the highest court in the land, essentially ruled that it wasn't equipped to double guess the government thinking on the sanctioning of one individual called Eugene Shridler, who's actually a British national, but obviously of Russian descent, an oligarch, very, very wealthy, uh, person who'd been sanctioned at the start of the war. And the Supreme Court came down on actually not being able to unpick an executive decision, on that, which one of the Supreme Court judges had a dissenting opinion, which obviously was overruled, by the majority, saying, "Well, this is clearly ridiculous. We're relying on civil servants, in Whitehall to decide on facts related to the law." So that was a massive, case for us, and I think that the consequences of that are still, unraveling. But when it comes to the law itself, the law, certainly in the UK system, I think also, in the EU system, it's not a law in the conventional sense. A normal law goes through parliamentary scrutiny and has to be passed by both houses of parliament and so on. But for the UK, the sanctions acts are legal instruments. They are subsets of pre-existing laws. That means they don't have to go through the same, parliamentary scrutiny as fully fledged laws. So we had an Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2019, and all UK sanctions against Russia now are based on statutory instruments. And I can tell you for a fact that after the war, in Ukraine started, those instruments were updated at least 10 times
mm.
every time we wanted to sanction different people. And I was involved in one of those updates, unfortunately. And actually, this was simply civil servants saying, well, actually, how can we broaden this statutory instrument so we can sanction more people with no legal scrutiny of that, with no parliamentary scrutiny of that? So the executive has land grabbed, a huge amount of legal and also parliamentary competence on this, in the UK. And I believe you're right that the same is true of the EU. And in any case, the EU institutions that are run by non-elected people. So it's a shocking actually shift to the right in terms of move to even greater, I think, extra legality in terms of how sanctions are applied. I just thought I'd kind of throw that into the mix because I think it's helpful for people to understand that deeper context to how sanctions work.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's the key aspect to understand. They're not legal measures. They're not taken by the judiciary. They're taken by the executive. And in your case, the same. I mean, the thing is, the only thing that these people then have to grapple with is how to base the tool on the sanctions tool upon existing legal structure, right? So that nobody can knock it down and say, like, with a court case, hey, the whole sanctions regime is illegal in the sense that it doesn't have a legal grounding. So what they do is they find the right parliamentary acts or laws already in place, or treaties, for the EU case. You find the right treaties that give the executive branch a certain power to do something, and for the EU, that's in the common foreign and security policy. It's that space, and within that space, then they follow the procedural rules to create the tool. And once it's there, then you just broaden its use. And that's actually, I talked to a German legal scholar, Hans-Georg Maaßen, and he explained it just like that, and they know that. They then expand it bit by bit. So first, the sanctions are being used only against the state, right? Only against Russia as a state. And the next step, of course, Vladimir Putin and the political leadership against them. Then the oligarchs, the people with the money to support. And then people inside Russia that might actually be German or something, and then people inside the European Union that we don't like, you go incrementally. And that's the process we're in, unfortunately, right now. And those, again, they are, since they are executive decisions. What happened in the UK, that the Supreme Court said, I will not judge upon whether this creates a legal problem or not. I will just look at the rationale. That's exactly the thing the European Court of Justice does. So the EU right now tells these people, Jacques Beau, Nathalie Yamb, and others, by way of just publishing it in their gazette, right? They just publish it on a page, and therefore it becomes the law of the land, the rule of the land, the sanction of the land. Informs them, oh, by the way, you have two mechanisms to oppose what we did, because we are bound by rules, and we of course have a legal mechanism. First mechanism, you can write to the European Commission itself and complain about the decision. So you can tell the very body that sanctioned you that you're not happy about it. That's one avenue, which is obviously a dead end. And the second avenue is you go to the European Court of Justice. Now, the EU Court of Justice, though, out of previous practice, what we know, will not judge whether these sanctions create a human rights infringement, whether they are constitutional or not. The only thing it will do is it will look at the rationale for the sanction, the little blurb extract that they give in the database, 1, 2, sometimes 3 paragraphs with the accusation. What is the accusation? And then it will judge whether the accusation is factual. So whatever is in there, it will try to look at, is that the case, yes or no? And if it says this is the case, then the decision will stand. If it's not the case, then it will order the revocation of the sanctioning. However, two howevers. However, one, if it orders the revocation, then the EU Commission can just change the paragraphs and everything starts anew. Secondly, if this is not a lie, if the victims cannot prove that there's a lie in there, if it is factually correct, then it will stand, and it can be factually correct with anything that's not illegal. If you can write in there, literally, this person is on the sanctions list because Ian Proud is male. If the court will not judge whether that's a reason to have you in there or not, it will only judge whether it's factually right or not. Which, if you think about it, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible that can happen. And that's also why, the people who are on this list with this little blurb, some of them, Hussein Dogru, didn't really work on Russia, not at all. He worked on Palestine, but he's being included, just a very flimsy little connection. But then even the blurb says like, oh, he's here because like he did journalistic work on Palestine, and because, well, that's actually factually true. He did. So speaking from how this system works, I mean, it's pretty sure that he will remain there. Unless there's enough political pressure to remove them. Nathalie Yamb, my compatriot, she's on that list because she's a anti-colonial activist for against French meddling in Africa, and the blurb actually says so. Oh, she's infringing upon. She's doing propaganda and attacking the French state and whatnot. So again, the problem that we have is that this is a heavy-handed tool, and a heavy-handed tool that works extremely well, and that circumvents the entire legal structures that we have built. And these things are done in a way that they switch off the courts. They all of them, like the national ones, and even on the top level. I mean, it is ridiculous that a Supreme Court and an ECJ both say, we will only look at whether it's actually true, but we will not judge on whether the government can do this or not. We defer to the government. It's like, okay, fine. I mean, that's basically the end of the idea that we have, co-equal branches that check on each other. And in a very sick way, this is actually what has to happen once states come under pressure from the inside and the outside. And it's what we have seen time and time again when democracies transform themselves into very, very dark things. I mean, this is just a historical fact. The moment when Hitler switched off the courts was when he published an executive decision saying that his acts that he did when he shot a couple of people were legal. Here's an executive order that says that what I did was legal. It's called in German the Ermächtigungsgesetz, like when he himself just published an executive order. This is fine, and it's fine because the executive said so. Um, we are not that far down the road yet. Not everything has been switched off, but this is a first step of the toward the for the executive to switch off the judiciary, and it's doing so interestingly through foreign policy in both the UK, Europe, and actually also in the United States. It's going the foreign policy route. So through foreign policy, then turning the weapons inward, right? The ones that were supposed to go to the outside and protect from the outside, they're now being turned against the enemy from within. And this is unfortunately something that's also in the United States is going on. And there's other branches of government that are involved in like fighting the enemy from within. In the UK, you have laws, I mean, the criminalization of Palestine action. That one at least went through the normal process. At least it's a proper law by Parliament. It's still bad, but at least it had to follow the proper process. What the executive is doing, it's switching off the actual parliamentary process.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And certainly in terms of, what you were talking about, you creep from Russia and gradually creep into Europe to pick on your own citizens. That gets even further and further away from the law at a time when the Supreme Court has decided that it is not in a position to judge the executive's actions. And what I mean by that is that the UK law says that the purpose of sanctions regulations is to force Russia to cease and desist its unstabilizing actions, in Ukraine. Well, with the thousands of people already sanctioned, many of whom are in very junior positions, they're in no position to influence, President Putin on that because they just have no power. And when you start, sanctioning commentators in Europe, like Jacques Bord and Natalie Yamb, then actually they're even further away from the possibility of influencing sort of Putin's decisions on ceasing and desisting. So the whole thing gets, as you say, starts to get very, very dark and turn inward upon itself, as you said. And I look at, I mean, I haven't followed either Zach or Natalie's works that closely, but I know Larry's work, fairly well, and I mean, he says some controversial things, but I don't think he says anything that's necessarily not rooted in what he believes to be true. And given his past extensive experience working for the US state, it does raise questions about how people, what is the dividing line between opinion and subversion. I mean, I don't know what it is. I mean, or opinion and dissent, and is there even a legal definition of dissent? I mean, where do you draw the line in deciding which alternative point of view, is within the legal boundaries? Not that those legal boundaries are enforced by the courts, and those which fall outside of the legal boundaries.
I mean, here we have several problems, right? Let's maybe start with Larry. I mean, he was punished not by the government, at least not as far as we know, but by a tech company. And of course, this hints at also one more problem that in order to actualize freedom of speech, what we need is these platforms here, right? And we need them to tolerate us, and we need them to tolerate speech as far as possible. But what we know through the Twitter files is that the government in the US tried to get around, constitutional guaranteed freedom of speech by arguing, oh, it's not us doing the censoring, not us, it's the companies, and the companies are free to do because they are, nobody can force them to have a contract and a legal relationship with any of the content creators, that's their thing. But then behind the scene, of course, like influencing them and telling them like switch off, switch off, switch off. So very, very kind of nasty. But at least in that case, the actors doing that from the government side understand that this is very hot territory and that they need to be careful and that they're actually treading on extremely thin ice. And once the Twitter files came out, I mean, the outrage about it in the United States was huge, right? And the outrage, if it came out again, that government is still trying to directly to interfere with the decisions of platforms is would be there. So in a sense, what we need is platforms having independence, proper, real independence, and then the question boils down to what is still not only what's legal, but what do the platforms allow for, and how far should that be? I mean, we would need to go pretty far into that one because you know it is also true that platforms must um, take care of the what is being published because of spam. I mean, people who will just abuse YouTube in order to advertise whatever kind of coffee brand. That's why YouTube says like in the comment sections, no advertisements because otherwise they will just become like useless amalgamations of various commercials, right? On the other hand, they cannot allow AI produced videos of URI. And we've had these problems, right? Alexander Mercouris was impersonated, John Mearsheimer was impersonated, Jeffrey Sachs was impersonated, and just like pretending to be them, having a channel, saying stuff that they never said, right? I mean, that is clearly also must be. I mean, it's not only legal impersonation, but the platforms must do something to prevent that from going up, right? So I do understand that media platforms are navigating an extremely difficult terrain where, on the one hand, they need to keep clean. They want to do the housekeeping. On the other hand, they need to make sure that freedom of speech is given. This is very difficult to do, but it needs to be taken serious, right? As a challenge, and I think it should be communicated and it should be talked about. And this corridor and the cleaning and how it works should also be discussed so that people are informed. And there should be transparency and a process also to appeal. One of the problems on YouTube is we don't have a proper appeals mechanism, at least not one including humans. That should be changed, right? There should be humans hired in order to do this kind of stuff. Google then says like, oh, but it's far too much. How can we do that? And it's like, yeah, we are a $1 billion profit company. Just use about 10 million to hire a couple of staff, please. I mean, those kind of things, right? But there's a real problem here. I mean, aspects that are technical in nature and therefore need technical also discussions in order to create transparency. On the other hand, we do have political persecution right now that is going on that we talked about with the sanctions, with debanking, and those problems actually need political action to deal with them because unfortunately the very people who tell us that they're here to protect democracy and freedom of speech and so on are the people who are trying to minimize them because it turns out that democracy to them means the right to rule themselves, and freedom of speech means the freedom to say what they want to hear. That's a big problem, and we have these people on the left and we have them on the right, and then we have a couple of people who actually stick to their guns when it comes to fundamentals. And on the right, it's the kind of the type of Tucker Carlson, who whether it's coming from the Republicans or the Democrats, he's just always against like curtailing speech. And on the left, we have them people like uh, uh, sorry, what's his system update with Glenn Greenwald, who will also stick his head out for somebody on the right, who gets unjustly censored because these people want the principle to be actualized. And unfortunately, on both sides, we have people who scream, protect freedom of speech only when is this their speech that is being infringed upon. And this is the environment that we are moving in. I hope that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, no, it actually makes, complete sense. And there's a certain irony about sort of Google, needing to kind of manage quite complex technical matters around the regulation of AI and unauthorized advertising content and the rest of it. And then having as a dispute mechanism a chatbot.
Yeah, it's horrible actually. That's what's so dystopian, right? I mean, that's where you would wish that Google would install a proper process where you then can talk to a person like any kind of larger company that sells you an airplane ticket. At some point you usually have a right to talk to a human being who does a review. But Google just doesn't do that because, I mean, also this one makes total sense because it's a profit maximizing strategy, right? Why throw out 10 million on a couple of people to do a review, a manual review mechanism if you can just do it online? And if one or two or three creators get like unjustly cut and thrown out, then so sad, too bad, unless they create a media shitstorm. Uh, just let it be, right? It's like that's the calculation, right? The cold capitalist calculation, like what makes more money, assuring that people have the proper rights on the platform, or just accepting collateral damage.
Yeah.
Well, let's go with that one. It's not even difficult. I understand it. If I was a Google CEO and I was paid, and I would be axed if I don't maximize profit, I would probably do that kind of very rational calculation. And it's like, well, that's why we need government to actually then tell these companies, oh, by the way, if you do not guarantee freedom of speech on the platform, then the punishment will be harsher than implementing proper regulations. This is actually what the European Union back in the days tried to do, and which is now, going also haywire. Um, so we need, the state and the companies, there's a constant interaction. But the more important a platform, the more important that there is guidelines which should then be informed by the way that we want to run our societies, which is more or less codified in our laws, and most importantly, codified in our constitutions, because that's how we want society to run. And
Yeah.
if people start throwing away the constitution and all of these principles, well, then we're in a crappy place. And unfortunately, we are coming closer and closer
To
to
that
the toilet.
crap.
Yeah, to the toilet. I mean, it's just over there. It
Exactly
stinks
right.
already.
I think the mainstream media outlets have less of an excuse, because when they have people on the TV, or they have people writing op-eds, they don't have the excuse about the challenges of technical regulation. That is entirely about them operating within you know government implied or stated guidelines. I mean, there was somebody posted on Twitter recently some BBC guidelines about what people could and couldn't say about the kidnapping of
Yeah,
Nicolas Maduro. You know,
yeah,
I believe, and there's that kind of, whether you're on the left or the right. You can talk about these things from your different political perspectives, but you can't step outside of the open window of what the government approves of. And you say, I
yeah.
mean, if I try and get an op-ed in the Financial Times, fat chance I'll have any success. So I mean, there's that sort of quieter censorship as well, where that's why I think Tucker Carlson is going, and Going Greenwald are different, because they choose to operate outside of that mainstream media space, and I think that's what makes them resonate with so many people, because there's an authenticity to it, whether they're on the right or whether they're on the left, and I think that authenticity is disappearing from mainstream media as they almost certainly when it relates to foreign policy, less on domestic policy in the UK, stick to the government line.
No, and it's this hypocrisy issue, right? Where people start, where we just all recognize that there's so much hypocrisy going on when the government says like, oh, we have principles and we have values when it comes to, like, let's say Iran, and then when it comes to Israel, the same principles and values are not applicable anymore, or they're being turned upside down. And that's something that frustrates a lot of us. This is why I like it when I see people like Tucker Carlson or Glenn Greenwald, who, when it comes to the principles, they stick up for the principle and not for the team. This is what's happening at the moment, right? People at the end of the day support the team instead of the principle, and that's a huge problem because it's going to ruin our society. It's ruining society. I mean, it has already been wreaking havoc on international relations with millions of dead. That kind of hypocrisy. But the more the hypocrisy is just being accepted, that that's just what it is. Rules for me, but not for rules for thee, but not for me, and stuff like that. And the end of this idea that we will stick to principles. Well, that's just a bad place to be in, because it will come to hunt all of us. All. I mean, rules, international law, domestic law, uh, they are not a fail-safe. Also, domestic law is not a fail-safe. But if everybody starts ignoring the prohibition from stealing stuff, then, well, I mean, we all got to arm ourselves, and we are up for a very, very bad future. So the same for in international law, right? very bad
Yeah.
future. But let me just come back 1 second because you're in the UK to also the way that unfortunately now governments are trying to carve out these spaces because the UK like 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago enacted this new what is it called, the Online Safety Act
Yes.
of 2023. And that thing, when it comes to media and publishing, is quite astonishing, what it allows. Um, I just need to read this to you, like Article 179 in Part 10 of the Online Safety Act, 179 on fails communication offenses. There are fails communication offenses. Says one, a person commits an offense if the person sends a message. B, the message conveys information that the person knows to be fails. C, at the time of sending it, the person intends the message or the information in it to cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm to likely audience. And D, the person has no reasonable excuse to sending the message. um the government basically setting up the like very clear not very very vague definitions of like what counts as a fails message. So and what kind of speech then is illegal, right?
Yeah.
If it constitutes a fails message,
Mm. Yeah.
basically a lie. So the government, the Ministry of Truth, has now a kernel in this Online Safety Act to then judge what is true and what is not. But it gets worse. That's Article 179 says then platforms and so on need to look out for this. Let me see. Yeah. Exemptions, Article 180, exemptions from offenses under Article 179. A. 1. A recognized news publisher cannot commit an offense under Article 179. An offense under Article 179 cannot be committed by the holder of a license under the Broadcasting Act of 1990 and 1996 in connection with anything done under the authority of the license. I mean, the
That is
BBC is
shocking.
officially allowed, is officially allowed to lie to you.
And
Broadcasters, the
does.
BBC, can lie in your face and it's not illegal. But if you and I on YouTube lie, I mean, according to Article 179, then that's an offense in the UK. Well, and now you tell me why people don't really trust me and the government anymore when you now have it in law. You have it in law that public broadcasters are allowed to create what Article 179 calls fails communication offense. It's
Yeah.
insane. It's insane. I mean, it's hard to communicate this because it is so insane. People will look at you and say like, nah, that can't be true. It's in goddamn writing in the goddamn act. So it's like, yeah, it's
Well,
pretty insane.
that's something that I noticed quite a lot. That rather than searching for actual hard information and data, people default to listening to what the mainstream news channels say. So people, there's been a big flight from evidence where we rely on what the news broadcasters tell us. And actually, on that Article 179, C and D are also incredibly ambiguous in how they're framed. And it isn't really about whether something is false, it's about whether something upsets somebody else, which is massively open to interpretation. Causing offense. Well, is that causing offense to somebody who has concerns about immigration, or is that causing offence to somebody,
Yeah.
who actually has views on trans rights and all the rest? I mean, how do you even start defining that? I mean, you can't. The government chooses what is offensive and not offensive. It's gone beyond what is false and what is true to what the government deems is offensive.
Yeah, but overall, there's a very clear pattern, which is toward creating legislation, but also executive decisions that then serve as tools for more freedom of action of the administrative state, of the people who then wield power over everybody else, and they create the instruments in a way that they are unconstraining on them and give them ultimate freedom of decision, which also makes sense because if you're sitting in one of these high offices, you want ways to do stuff, the good
Yeah,
stuff, right? Because you're on the good, right side of history. I mean,
you're a
you're in
good
the forest of
person. You've been
light. That's
elected.
right. Yeah, Yeah, or you're sitting there. I mean, the one thing that I don't agree is that EU bureaucrats are not the people in the EU Council and so on in von der Leyen and so on, that they're not elected. They are elected in the same way that most governments, including yours, are elected through parliament, right? Through indirectly through the mechanism. I mean, no, the Hexeth, Minister of Defense in the UK, in the US, the Secretary of Defense in the US, um, or Marco Rubio. They're not elected either, but they're sitting there by way of the way the Constitution in a democratic way has decided that it happens. In the UK too, the Prime Minister is not directly elected, but indirectly through the
Yeah,
mandate given
yeah,
to
yeah.
the Parliament, right? So same for the EU, but nevertheless, I mean that doesn't even matter. I mean, these people, nobody within the process must have absolute power. That's why we do separation of power. And democracy is not voting is just one of the pillars. The other pillar is the separation of power. If you take away that pillar, then you can vote how much ever you want. It won't matter. You need to separate the branches, otherwise it doesn't work. And in any kind of drive toward authoritarianism, what you always see is that one branch will take away power from the others, and more and more and more. Usually it's the executive. Sometimes it happens that somebody tries to take over the legislative. Sometimes it's the military, but it is one of the branches of power that will amass from the others, and then in the end, rule that all of this was fine. And unfortunately, we are in that kind of process.
We are. And just one final thought, because I know you have to rush off, and I'm sorry that our start was delayed, but it's striking to me that the response to the George Floyd murder, back in 2020, and the response to the sort of the murder in Minnesota of Good, the beautiful young lady with three children who was killed by ICE operatives, received drastically different coverage, from the mainstream media in the US and also internationally, who've been remarkably muted. I mean, I think that sends a very, very worrying sort of signal for how far we've drifted, over the past, 4 years. So thank you so much, Pascal. That's been an absolutely brilliant discussion, as I knew it would be. I mean, thank you so much. I think we've really dived deep into issues around sanctions in particular, and I think viewers will find that incredibly helpful. Obviously, everybody will know that Pascal runs the remarkably brilliant Neutrality Studies podcast without me telling you, but I'm going to tell you anyway. But just thanks again so much for all that you do to promote neutrality and indirectly to promote peace as well. Thank you so much. Good luck with your ongoing endeavors. And to all of my viewers, I wish you all continued peace.